Hello, everyone. Welcome back. If you clicked on this video, you likely already know that my name is Sundown, and this is Logically Free Spirited, a channel where I talk about all things relating to science and spirituality while remaining grounded yet open minded. And I've also been doing a lot of live focus sessions lately, but if for some reason, if you did not know that or you do not know who I am, then I would like to please redirect you, new friend, to the playlist linked above as well as in the description box below. Because this video is part of a series where I do deep dives into each episode of the incredible podcast, the Telepathy tapes. And today we are going to be talking about episode 7. So if you aren't caught up, please go back to the beginning, as it's kind of imperative that you have all of the information that has been covered so far. Okay, now that that is out of the way and we are all friends here, you guys, I'm so excited. I got a new mic. Her name is Decibel, or Desi, and I'm still learning the ropes, so let me know how this sounds. Does it sound better? Also, now feels like a good time to remind you that if you have been enjoying this series so far, please like and sub if you haven't already. It would sincerely mean so much to me. There have definitely been people actively disliking my content because they disagree with the topic, and I am all for differences, but you would really be doing me a solid if you would engage in any way that feels good to you. But enough of that, let's go ahead and get right into it. Today, we are meeting another telepath, Amelia. At the time of recording, Amelia was 10 years old and lives near Milwaukee with her parents, Mike and Maura. Currently, Amelia wants to become a genetics doctor and plans to attend either Harvard or the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the future. And Amelia has a condition called DDX3X syndrome, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder caused by mutations in the DDX3X gene, which is located on the X chromosome. This disorder primarily affects females and can manifest as intellectual disabilities, developmental delays, autism, ADHD, and low muscle tone. However, Moira says that while the physical aspects of the disorder hold true for her daughter, Amelia is actually very aware and has the opposite of any sort of intellectual disability. Mike adds that outside of not being able to speak or sprint across the yard, there's nothing intellectually different about Amelia from other kids. Although, as we all know, that is unfortunately just not the way that she's treated. At some point, I'm not exactly sure when, Amelia learned to spell. Like many spellers, she was initially supported under her hand, which eventually progressed to her wrist, her forearm, her elbow, before she became fully independent and now no longer requires any sort of physical support. Which again, this makes me so mad when I think of all of the people who are anti-spelling because they believe that the communication is that of the communication partner, not the non-speaker. Because how do you explain the progression towards independence? It's like expecting someone to be able to run before they've even learned to crawl. Also, in case you aren't caught up with the telepathy tapes stuff, the most recent episode of the talk tracks is actually specifically about the argument against spelling, and I highly recommend it. Anyway, Amelia currently uses a speaking device with letters and predictive text features, so essentially an AAC device like we've discussed before. And Maura explains that Amelia started regularly spelling out things that she, Maura, was thinking about. Eventually, Maura just asked her directly, "Can you read my mind?" And Amelia said yes. Like other families, they thought that they were the only ones that this could possibly be happening to. And then on top of that, Mike and Maura were not immediately aligned with what was occurring. While Kai describes Maura as very logical, they both say that Mike is more so. He's ex-military, he works in spreadsheets, and he describes himself as a man of science. And this reminds me of the last episode when I referenced people saying, "I don't believe in God, I believe in science." Anyway, it took others coming forward with their experiences with Amelia before Mike came around, and those experiences were abundant. Amelia was reading the minds of not only her mother, but also of her babysitter, her therapists, and her teachers at school. First, we meet Katie, which is Amelia's para. And as a reminder, para refers to paraprofessional, which is essentially a professional teaching assistant who supports special needs students. Katie worked with Amelia throughout the 3rd and 4th grade, and she came to believe that Amelia is telepathic after discovering that Amelia knew the password to her computer. This led to some more personal testing, and it simply snowballed from there. We also meet Jody, who is Amelia's treatment therapist. She's the one who sets up programs for Amelia and then supervises the people who work with her on a day-to-day basis. When asked how she came to believe in Amelia's telepathic abilities, she tells a story of being late to school one day and coming in and exclaiming, "You'll never guess why I was late," to which Amelia typed 3 turkeys. And she was exactly right. Jody was held up in traffic due to 3 large turkeys that were acting as roadblocks on her way to work that morning. Eventually, she started asking Amelia additional questions that she says that Amelia would have no way of knowing the answers to. Personal questions, to the extent that, like Maura, Jody just asked her directly, "Can you read my mind?" And again, Amelia said yes. Beyond telepathy, like some others we have met, we also learned that Amelia knows multiple languages. She has communicated that in English as well as Spanish, Portuguese, and Hebrew. And then we find out that she is also familiar with hieroglyphics. This information was discovered by her therapist, Jody, as well as 2 other therapists that we hadn't yet met, Sydney and Allie. At some point, they discovered that Amelia could read Hebrew, and they were so astonished that they asked her what else she knew that might surprise them, and she said hiero. After clarifying that this meant hieroglyphics, they tested her by showing her hieroglyphics that they themselves did not know the meanings of, in effort to rule out the opportunity for her to read the answers from their minds, if you will. And then they only looked up the answers after Amelia gave hers, but she was correct. So this is different from what we've previously discussed, how when Dr. Powell was researching autistic savants, she had some caregivers explaining to her that they didn't necessarily believe that their child was a savant, but rather they believed that they may simply be reading the answer to whatever it is from their mind. This eliminates that, at least to their personal experience of testing Amelia. Now, where she was getting the answers from, we will circle back to that. I want to note that Jody says that while Amelia does both, she is better at understanding and reading other languages than she is at typing them. And she believes that that has something to do with consciousness, which makes sense to me. Essentially, when Amelia receives information, whether telepathically or by listening to or reading other languages, or even through symbols like hieroglyphics, she's not processing the words themselves so much as experiencing the meaning. She's receiving a feeling and understanding. And I believe that if someone was capable of receiving telepathic messages from Amelia, she could probably communicate that message right back with ease. But when it comes to talking to us voice users, she has to take that telepathic impression and translate it into words, English words, or whatever language, and then summon all of the motor skills she can possibly control to physically type out a response. So, of course, it makes sense that it would be easier for her to understand or receive languages than to express them. In addition to understanding multiple languages and being telepathic, Amelia also experiences a pretty unfortunate form of precognition, becoming aware of horrific and often tragic events prior to their occurrence, unfortunately without enough information to prevent anything from happening. On one hand, how awful to experience that and be unable to help. The grief and the sadness and the overwhelm that she must experience, but on the other hand, I'm grateful that at least she's not in a position where she's being forced to or expected to be a superhero. I don't believe that anyone should have that unasked for cross to bear. Finally, to top all of this off, Amelia also sees spirits, and her mother told a really interesting story. At one point, Amelia's parents were trying to identify a female spirit that Amelia was seeing, and they showed her a photo of Lori, who was her father's sister who had passed away from cancer. The first photo they showed her was from later in Lori's life, when she was sick and her body reflected this. Amelia didn't recognize her. But then they shared an older photo from before Lori was sick, and immediately Amelia identified her. And I find this really curious. I mean, think about it. How interesting is it that the visual representation of Laurie's spirit to Amelia wasn't that of herself at death, but at a time before, a time when she was healthy? And this kind of makes me wonder why or how. And at what time exactly in her life? Was it right before she got sick? Was it before she showed visible signs of sickness? Or could it be what she would have looked like at the time of death had she not been sick? And did she pick this form? And do we all get to? And for the millionth time, how does reincarnation play into all of this? Also, please know, I read every single comment that you guys leave, and I've received many comments about reincarnation. And someone in particular, I'll put the handle up, had a really amazing comparison to school. In their example, life on Earth in the 3D is school. And when school is finished, we go home. And in this scenario, home would mean where we return post-mortem. They add that we can always come back to school the next day, incarnate again, or perhaps retake a break from school or a gap year, periods where you are not reincarnated. So maybe my question is, are spirits simply on vacation from the human experience? I'm just thinking out loud here. I have no idea. Anyway, in the podcast, they detail how ultimately they verified that it really was, in fact, Laurie that Amelia was seeing. And it's a beautiful story about a gift to Mike's other sister, and it's just another reason why it's worth listening to the podcast, if for any reason I haven't convinced you yet. Anyway, it doesn't stop there. Amelia experiences not only spirits of those who have passed, but also spirits of the living, and that's actually been increasing as of late. Unfortunately, it seems to be a side effect of the telepathy tapes. Now that awareness is spreading, more spirits and non-speakers who may need help are reaching out to Amelia telepathically. And understandably, it's overwhelming her. It seems like this may be happening because the non-speakers now know that we, the speakers, are starting to understand and to believe. It seems like they may feel safer, like they believe that there's a chance that if they can send a message, it will actually be received. But again, Amelia's receiving these really heavy messages without enough information to actually help the people involved. And that is so heartbreaking. And all of this has caused Amelia to shut down at times. And because of this, Kai thankfully thought to introduce her and her family to Houston and Katie, which, of course, they need no introduction with any of us at this point. It started by Maura and Amelia visiting a therapist that Houston had seen particularly to help with body control. Because they don't live in the Atlanta area where this practice is, they did an intensive week with a therapist in Georgia and then met with Katie and Houston on the downtime. Houston is much more proficient than Amelia is when it comes to typing. So they took this opportunity to ask Amelia questions and have her provide the answers to Houston telepathically. And then Houston, in turn, would type out those answers. I mean, how cool is that? A lot of the things discussed would be considered normal, like wanting chocolate milk with breakfast, or that cheese hurts her stomach, but she still loves it. But there were also more curious things, like the fact that Amelia can read sheet music, which, fun fact about me, I used to also be able to read sheet music, but I don't think I can anymore. Anyway, they went on to add that Amelia amazingly has perfect pitch, and I'm not going to lie, this one kind of confuses me. Amelia is nonverbal, but can she sing? Does she sing? Is it perfect pitch in her mind, or if she could sing, she would have perfect pitch? There's no elaboration on that, but she also added that she can speak multiple languages, but that she picked English, which I think is a curious word choice. She also added that Cleopatra took her to meet God and that she wanted her mom to know how much she loves God's house. So this one gave me pause, but I understand that we cannot pick and choose what to believe, so here is where things become a little more esoteric. I mentioned earlier that we were going to circle back to how Amelia knows all of this information that she reportedly shouldn't, and it's different from what we've previously heard. When they found out that Amelia knew Hebrew, they didn't ask her how she knew this, but rather who taught her Hebrew, and Amelia responded with the rabbi. They then asked her who taught her hieroglyphics, and she answered, the god. Mora goes on to explain that Amelia says that God, or sometimes the gods, plural, come to her and teach her at night, and that quite frankly, it disrupts her sleep. But also at one point, they start asking Amelia about something. I don't exactly remember what it was, but it was something else that they weren't anticipating her knowing. And they asked her if she had always known this information or whatever it was, if she'd known it since she was a baby. And she said, since before. And again, I'm confused. I guess maybe confused isn't the right word, but I want to point out all of the things that we've explored regarding this so far. We've talked about the Akashic records. We've looked at the Bannister effect and how it could represent collective consciousness. And now we're talking about or hearing about what Amelia and her family call God visits that happen in the middle of the night when she is sleeping. But yet there are some things that she's known since before she was a baby. And in a little bit, we're going to hear about some cases of osmosis. I'm not saying this necessarily contradicts each other. I'm just laying out all of the information. Mora went on to ask Amelia for a bit more clarification, asking if there are multiple gods or just one god with different names. And Amelia said different names. So perhaps here what we see is that concept of one consciousness that branches off into different forms, not only as us individuals, but maybe different forms of gods. These gods. Anyway, Kai notes how often Amelia mentions God while Mora and Mike are actually not religious themselves. Mora adds that some people try to make the argument that if these telepaths are reading the minds of their loved ones, and if that loved one is particularly religious, the telepath's communication could be reflective of whatever that other person believes. However, Mora contradicts this argument by example. Kai goes on to conclude how heartwarming it was to see Houston and Amelia communicating, especially as there is an epidemic of loneliness among these non-speakers, particularly among those who have never learned to spell. One of the comments I've received on a previous video asked how we can help befriend and connect with these non-speakers. And an answer I heard from Kai in another podcast somewhere was to volunteer and connect with the non-speakers in your community. However, I know that's not actually the easiest thing to do. Many people have expressed difficulties in even finding organizations in their areas, but these non-speakers are out there, and where there's a will, there's a way. They've literally been teaching that to us throughout this whole process. And if I find out any information of any other ways that we can all get involved, I promise to pass it along right away. But now we move on to the next section, and things get a bit more research heavy. Here is where we meet Joe. Joe was a trial attorney in New York for 25 years before moving to Arizona and completely switching professions. He became an associate pastor or minister of adult education at Highlands Church, and during this time, he has worked closely with 4 autistic non-speakers. When he first started communicating with them, he admits that he had to come to terms not only with the validity of spelling, but also with the spiritual gifts that he was witnessing. He said he was extremely skeptical and found himself almost instinctively slipping into what he called lawyer mode. One of the first things that he did was dive into the research. He said the roughly 40 or so negative papers he could find were mostly from the 1990s, back in the earliest stages of facilitated communication, long before it evolved into the newer, more independent methods like spelling to communicate and the rapid prompting method, which do not require any sort of physical interaction. But he also found over 100 or more recent studies that have kind of reconsidered these early conclusions and suggest that maybe something had been missed, that maybe there really is something here worth paying attention to. And again, that is what is covered in the most recent episode of the Talk Tracks, episode 8. It's also what we're going to talk about in my next episode. But one study that Joe cited came from the University of Virginia, where researchers tracked the eye and hand movements of spellers to determine if their eye or hand moved first. Joe says that the results indicated that the eyes moved first, pointing towards intentionality. So, of course, I looked the study up. The study was conducted in 2020 by Vikram Jaswal, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, and I'm so sorry, Vikram. But also Allison Wayne and Hudson Golino, and published in Scientific Reports. It was titled Eye Tracking Reveals Agency in Autistic or Assisted Autistic Communication. The study included 9 non-speaking autistic spellers, and they found that the participants fixated on the letters approximately half a second before moving their hands. So, like Joe said, this demonstrates intentionality and that the communication is actually that of the spellers. And I've linked all of this below. But what I do want to add is that from what we've seen so far, this isn't always the case, right? If you remember back in episode 1, we met Mia. She experiences synesthesia. She sees colors when interpreting letters and numbers. And often she spells without ever looking at the letterboard. She sees the reflection of the colors on the walls or in the ether somewhere. And then there's Akil, who full-on claims to be able to see through his mother's eyes. Again, I'm just bringing it full circle, not to discredit anything, especially because, as we all know, both Mia and Akil are now fully independent. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a moot point. Anyway, back to Joe. He and Kai had a conversation about the kinds of questions that lawyers typically ask when evaluating whether someone is telling the truth or not. And Joe says that these non-speakers don't want attention. They're not incentivized by money. In fact, he says that, at least in his experience, people with autism are among the most honest individuals that any one of us could meet. That lying is actually difficult for them, and what is seemingly impossible is perpetuating a lie, continuing to build upon it over time. What would be required if someone was falsely claiming telepathy for years and years? Katie, Houston's mom, told Kai that it takes so much motor planning and energy just to get out one sentence that there's no way that these spellers would go to all of that effort just to lie. The level of physical and cognitive coordination isn't something that they would willingly spend on a falsehood. And remember what Houston said, you don't get these kinds of gifts if you lie. Additionally, Joe reveals that he's also researched hallucinations and that they are just simply not shared events, as in thousands of non-speakers and their families cannot all be hallucinating their experiences with telepathy or of the hill or of seeing spirits or of talking to God. Joe goes on to recount a story of one of his autistic students continually typing to her father to be careful because he was going to slip on ice and hurt his hip. At the time, neither Joe nor her father really knew what to make of this. If you remember, I said they live in the Phoenix Valley area, and if you're not familiar, that area is not notorious for tons of ice. Anyway, sure enough, her father got called away on a business trip, and while there, he did slip and fall on a patch of black ice and indeed severely injured his hip. So this makes me wonder, had he better heeded her warning, could he have changed his fate? I don't have the answer to that, I'm just honestly asking. Anyway, Joe goes on to explain that he is especially close to one particular speller named Cody, and he was telling Kai about a recent Zoom conversation between Cody, who lives in Arizona, and another speller named Josiah, who lives in Minnesota. It was the first time that they had ever met, but Joe said it felt like they already knew each other. It was really endearing in the podcast because you can just hear how excited and moved he is. Towards the end of the conversation, Josiah typed to Cody and said, "Come and join us on the hill sometime." And Joe was totally confused. Everyone in the room looked around, unsure of what it meant, so they just asked Cody directly. And Cody explained that the hill is a place where people with autism are able to gather and visit with other people with autism. And then Cody added that his communication partner had actually seen the hill herself. When everyone turned to look at her, she had tears in her eyes and said, "All I can tell you is that there was this perfect peace and joy, and it was like I never wanted to leave." She thought it was a dream. She said that it only happened once and that she knew that there were children there. Joe asked Cody why his spelling partner was allowed to go to the hill, and Cody explained that the children there also had autism. And his spelling partner added that she believes that she was allowed to visit the hill so that she could better tune her heart to the people that she supports, so she could understand them more deeply. And this is the first time in the telepathy tapes proper that we hear about neurotypicals visiting the hill, but it's not the last. I've mentioned this before, but again, in the talk tracks, in the very first episode, we hear from others who have been to the hill. Kai says that she's learned from the non-speakers that people are far more likely to be welcomed into these gifts and to be shown what is real if they have pure intentions and a good heart. And I just want to add that one of the most touching parts of this entire exchange is the fact that when Joe was explaining all of this to Kai, he had no idea that she had ever even heard of the hill. Really and truly, this was just another case of validation. Anyway, in the next section, we return to Jess, the teacher from England who has a specific student called Asher, starting some 30 years ago, with whom she has a telepathic bond. As a reminder, Asher was verbal until his 20s, when essentially he deemed it a waste of energy. But long before then, in the days prior to his mother's death, Asher's mother asked if Jess would maintain a relationship and friendship with Asher when she was no longer his teacher. And of course, she obliged. She said they still see each other regularly, and every few weeks they go on some sort of trip via train. And when that first started, Asher started really telling Jess about some of his experiences, which, similar to Amelia, included visions and precognition. Beyond that, Jess said that Asher loved to speak about anything and everything metaphysical and advanced, but that it was hard to keep up with him. She said she would read books about everything she could, but there was this one book that she had that just went completely beyond her comprehension. So one day she told Asher about this, and he asked her if she had the book on her, which she did. So he had her place the book. Do I have one? On her hand, and then he placed his hand on top of the book. And after a few seconds, he gave her a complete summary of the context in a very concise and clear fashion, outlining the basics in a way that she could understand. So naturally, she asked him if he does this with all books, and he said yes. Now, this is another new one for us. They don't say this in the podcast, but essentially what they're describing is a type of osmosis. Jess adds that Asher still does this when he, quote, moves out of body and goes into what he calls the realms, a sort of psychological landscape, end quote, that he contacts Jess from. And Kai compares this to the realm, or this realm, to that fundamental consciousness concept we keep discussing. Jess also says that she can ask Asher about anything, like consciousness, and that Asher says the knowledge he accesses from an Akashic records-like standpoint is similar to a huge library in which he feels pulled or guided towards a specific bit of information that she might be asking him about, and then he can simply download or absorb that information that he needs in order to answer her question. Thankfully, Kai digs a bit deeper on this and asks specifically what Asher has said about consciousness, and Jess said that he said that it precedes and proceeds beyond the earth experience, and that the body is just a temporary part of consciousness. And I don't know about you, but I find that to be very, very hopeful and honestly a relieving answer. Kai continues to dig and asks Jess how she knows that the thoughts she's telepathically receiving are from Asher and not her own, if she's ever been able to prove or verify any of the information she's received from him. And one of the things that she said is that Asher regularly uses words that aren't in her personal vocabulary, and she has to then look up those words, and every time the word makes perfect sense in the context of the conversation. For example, Jess was telling Asher about a friend of hers who was suffering from migraines, in which Asher responded with myelin. And then Jess looked that up, and she learned about the myelin sheath, which is essentially an insulating layer that surrounds the nerve cells in the brain and the spinal cord. And its dysfunction was indeed what was causing Jess's friend's migraines. So not only an increased vocabulary, but also diagnosing. Finally, Kai brings back Susie Miller, the teacher and speech language pathologist and author that we met from episode 5. She talks of students energetically working with those they love in very real ways, and often says that they, the children, repeatedly mention things like the new science, the new education, the new technology, and even the new currency, which they call the currency of love. Susie likes to call these individuals spiritual savants. She explains that their spiritual abilities, like telekinesis, the ability to heal, and the ability to interact with other realms, are often overlooked by those who don't understand them. It's a level of sensitivity that allows them to experience reality in a way that most neurotypicals can't even fathom. And Kai believes that the non speakers have the ability to tap into these spiritual gifts and make profound changes. But to truly see this potential, she says that we need a paradigm shift, and that this shift is a shift in understanding. It's a crucial step in recognizing the power that these children hold. She added that if she had $1 million, she'd want to open a healing and education center, envisioning a space where non speakers could collaborate with the brightest minds in science and math and healthcare, where they could heal people, relationships, animals, and even the planet itself. And finally, she also shared that in the past month or so, non speakers have been coming forward en masse. And as their truth becomes more widely known and people are coming to believe and understand this is happening, the belief in them and what they are capable of has been rising dramatically. And this is literally why I'm doing this. It makes this all worth it, every bit of it. But that's it. That's it for this one. Until the next episode, when we dive into why spelling is so controversial. We'll meet another telepath, and I'll probably incorporate the next Talk Tracks episode that I keep referencing, as well as maybe something deeper about the placebo effect. But until then, stay kind, and I'll see you all very soon. Thank you so much for being here. Let me know your thoughts on this episode, and I love you guys. Bye. Nope.